I thought my mother loved me until I walked into her house and saw every single family photo on the mantel had been altered. My face was gone, cut out, replaced with my half-sister's. 23 years of memories erased like I never existed. But what I discovered in that lawyer's office 3 months later would destroy everything she thought she knew about her perfect new family. The tape was rolling the whole time, and she had no idea. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The moving truck pulled away from 1247 Oakwood Drive on a Tuesday morning in September, taking with it the last remnants of my childhood home. I should have felt sad watching Dad's old workshop equipment disappear around the corner, but all I felt was relief. After 18 months of legal battles following his sudden death, Mom had finally agreed to sell the house we'd lived in for over 2 decades. I wasn't supposed to be there that morning. The realtor had scheduled the final walkthrough for noon, but I'd driven over early to grab a box of Dad's tools from the garage that somehow got overlooked during the estate division. Mom's silver Honda was already in the driveway when I arrived, which struck me as odd since she'd moved in with her new husband Marcus 2 towns over and rarely came back to the old neighborhood. The spare key was still hidden under the ceramic, frog by the front steps. Dad had put that thing there when I was 7, and it had become our little family joke over the years. I let myself in quietly, not wanting to startle Mom if she was inside having some kind of emotional moment. The house felt hollow and strange with all the furniture gone, my footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors Dad had installed himself the summer before his heart attack. I headed straight for the kitchen, planning to grab a garbage bag for the tools and leave Mom to whatever she was doing. But as I passed through the living room, something caught my eye that made my blood run cold. The mantel above the fireplace still had a row of family photos arranged along its length. Mom had insisted on keeping them as part of her share of the estate, claiming they held too much sentimental value to divide up. Every single photo had been altered. I moved closer, my hands shaking as I picked up the first frame. It was from my high school graduation, a picture Dad had taken of Mom and me outside the auditorium. I remembered that day perfectly because it had rained, and we'd all gotten soaked running to the car afterward. But in this photo, where my face should have been, someone had carefully cut and pasted a photo of Stephanie, Mom's stepdaughter from her marriage to Marcus. The next photo was even more disturbing. My 8th grade school portrait, the one where I'd worn Dad's old tie because I thought it looked sophisticated. My face had been meticulously removed and replaced with another shot of Stephanie. The work was skilled, professional even, but there were tiny telltale signs around the edges where the paper had been cut and glued. Photo after photo told the same horrifying story. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, family vacations, school events. 23 years of my life systematically erased and replaced with images of a girl who hadn't even been part of our family until 3 years ago. "What are you doing?" "Here, Jessica?" I spun around to find Mom standing in the kitchen doorway. She was dressed in one of her expensive new outfits, the kind Marcus could afford to buy her that Dad never could. Her face was flushed, and she was clutching a small digital camera in her right hand. "I came for Dad's tools," I managed to say, holding up the graduation photo. "What is this, Mom? What did you do to our pictures?" She walked over and took the frame from my hands with surprising gentleness, as if she were handling something precious. "I improved them," she said simply. "Stephanie photographs so much better than you ever did. She has Marcus's bone structure." The casual cruelty of her words hit me like a physical blow. "These are memories of me and Dad. You can't just erase me from them." "I can do whatever I want with my possessions," Mom replied, setting the photo back on the mantel with careful precision. "The court awarded me the family photographs. They're mine now." I stared at her, trying to recognize the woman who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with homework and held me when I cried over my first heartbreak. This cold stranger wearing her face, Felt like someone I'd never met. Dad would be devastated if he could see this, I whispered. Something flickered across Mom's expression then, so quick I almost missed it. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But it vanished immediately, replaced by the steely determination I'd come to know well during the estate proceedings. Your father isn't here to have opinions about anything, she said. I'm building a new life with Marcus and Stephanie. A better life. There's no room in it for constant reminders of how difficult things used to be. Difficult? The word came out as a shout. I was your daughter. I am your daughter. You're a grown woman who can take care of herself, Mom said, moving to straighten another photograph. Stephanie is still in high school. She needs stability and a complete family unit. These photos help establish that for her. I watched in stunned silence as she used a small cloth to clean the glass on a picture from my 10th birthday party. In the original, I'd been blowing out candles on the chocolate cake Dad had made from scratch. Now Stephanie's face smiled back from above those same candles, as if she'd been there celebrating with us 12 years before we ever met her. You're sick, I said quietly. This is delusional. Mom turned to face me fully then, and I saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. I suggest you leave, Jessica. You're trespassing. Trespassing? This was my home for 18 years, was being the operative phrase. I don't want you here anymore. I don't want you in my life anymore. Can't you understand that? Everything is better without you in it. The words hung in the air between us like poison. I felt something break inside my chest, some fundamental connection that I'd assumed could never be severed. Looking at my mother's face, I realized she meant every word. Turned and walked toward the front door, my legs feeling unsteady. Behind me, I could hear her moving around the living room, probably rearranging her grotesque gallery of altered memories. Jessica, she called out just as I reached for the door handle. I turned back, hoping against hope that she'd changed her mind, that some spark of maternal love had flickered back to life. Instead, she held up the digital camera. I need you to move away from the mantel. You're blocking my shot of Stephanie's photos. I left the house and sat in my car for 20 minutes, crying until I couldn't breathe. Eventually, I drove to my apartment across town and called my father's brother Robert, the only family member who'd remained neutral during the estate battle. He listened quietly as I told him what I'd discovered, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief. There has to be something we can do, I said when I'd finished the story. This isn't normal behavior. She needs help. Uncle Robert was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, he said finally. But you can't force someone to get help if they don't want it. And honestly, Jessica, maybe it's time to consider that your mother has made her choice. Maybe it's time for you to make yours. That night, I lay awake thinking about the woman who had raised me. Had there been signs over the years that I'd missed? Moments when her love had felt conditional, transactional? I searched my memories for clues, but all I could see was the careful way she'd positioned each altered photograph on that mantel, as if she were curating a museum exhibit of the family she wished she'd had, instead of the one she'd actually lived with. 3 days later, I made a decision that would change everything. The decision I made was to hire a private investigator. I know it sounds extreme, but something about my mother's behavior felt calculated in a way that went beyond grief or even mental illness. The precision of those photo alterations, the coldness in her voice, the way she'd positioned herself to inherit the house while pushing me out of the family entirely, it all suggested a level of planning that made my skin crawl. I found Patricia Kellerman through a recommendation from a friend who'd used her services during a messy divorce. Patricia's office was located above a sandwich shop downtown, cramped but organized with filing cabinets that reached the ceiling. She was in her 50s with sharp eyes and prematurely gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. Family. Disputes are always the worst, she said after I'd explained the situation. Money makes people do things they never thought they were capable of. Tell me about your father's estate. I pulled out the legal documents I'd brought with me. Dad died of a sudden heart attack 18 months ago. No will. Under state law, everything was supposed to be split equally between Mom and me, but she fought me on every single item: the house, his business assets, even personal belongings that clearly should have come to me. Patricia flipped through the eye. Papers with practiced efficiency. Says here your mother claimed you had been estranged from your father for several years before his death, that you rarely visited or called. That's completely false. I had dinner with my parents every Sunday. I helped Dad with his contracting business during busy seasons. We were close. I could hear the defensiveness in my own voice. But you couldn't prove the extent of your relationship in court? I shook my head. Most of our time together wasn't documented. We weren't the type of family that took photos of every meal or kept calendars of every conversation. It was just normal family stuff. Patricia made a note on her legal pad. What changed your mother's behavior? When did she start fighting you over inheritance? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I thought back to those awful months after Dad's funeral. It started about 2 weeks after he died. She met Marcus at a grief support group. Within a month, she was spending more time at his house than at home. Within 3 months, they were engaged. Fast timeline. I thought so too. Marcus has money. He owns a chain of auto parts stores. His daughter Stephanie was a sophomore. In high school when they got together, Mom seemed completely obsessed with playing mother to her. Patricia leaned back in her chair. And your father's estate was worth how much? About $400,000, mostly tied up in the house and his business equipment. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. Enough to make the difference between a comfortable life with her new husband and a truly wealthy one. Patricia tapped her pen against the desk. What exactly do you want me to investigate? I'd been thinking about that question for days. I want to know if my mother planned this. If she somehow orchestrated Dad's death or manipulated the situation afterward. And I want to understand why she's trying to erase me from existence. Those are serious allegations, Jessica. Are you prepared for what we might find? The question hung in the air for a moment. Was I ready to discover that my mother might be capable of murder? That the woman who'd raised me could have killed my father for money and a chance at a different life? Yes, I said finally. I need to know the truth. Patricia's investigation took 6 weeks. She was thorough and professional, providing me with weekly updates that gradually painted a disturbing picture of my mother's activities in the months surrounding Dad's death. The first revelation came through medical records. Patricia had contacts at the hospital where Dad had been taken after his heart attack, and she discovered that he'd been experiencing chest pains for several weeks before the fatal incident. More importantly, he'd scheduled an appointment with a cardiologist that Mom had canceled the day before, claiming he was feeling better. She told the doctor's office that your father had decided he didn't need to be seen, Patricia explained during one of our meetings. But according to his work calendar, he had blocked out the entire afternoon for that appointment. He clearly intended to go. The second discovery was financial. In the 3 months before Dad's death, Mom had been researching life insurance, policies, and estate planning attorneys. Her internet search history, which Patricia had obtained through methods she didn't specify, showed dozens of queries about inheritance laws, probate procedures, and the legal definition of estrangement between parents and adult children. She was educating herself, Patricia said, learning exactly how to maximize her inheritance and minimize yours. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Patricia had been tracking Mom's movements during the weeks after Dad's funeral, trying to establish a timeline of when she'd met Marcus and how quickly their relationship had progressed. What she discovered was that Mom and Marcus had been in contact for over a year before Dad's death. I found records of phone calls, text messages, even a hotel reservation from 14 months ago. Patricia told me. Your mother and Marcus were having an affair long before your father died. I stared at the documents spread across Patricia's desk, feeling sick. But she met him at a grief support group. She told everyone that. She did attend the grief support group, but she'd already been seeing Marcus for months. The group meeting was just convenient cover for their existing relationship. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me want to scream. So she was planning to leave Dad anyway. But when he died suddenly, she saw an opportunity to get everything instead of just half in a divorce settlement. Patricia's voice was matter of fact, but I could see the disgust in her eyes. The question is whether she helped that opportunity along. You think she killed him? I think she certainly had motive and opportunity, but proving it would be nearly impossible at this point. The body was cremated, so there's no chance for additional toxicology tests. The medical examiner ruled it a natural death, and there's no evidence of any external intervention. I felt defeated. Even with all this information, there was no way to get justice for Dad or to reclaim what had been stolen from me. But Patricia wasn't finished. There is one more thing, she said, pulling out a small digital recording device. I've been monitoring your mother's communications as part of the investigation. Yesterday, she had a very interesting phone conversation with Marcus about something they're calling the Jessica problem. She pressed play, and I heard my mother's voice coming through the tinny speaker, clearer than I'd ever wanted to hear it. We need to make sure she never finds out about the pills, Mom was saying. If anyone discovers that I was giving them to him in the weeks before he died, everything falls apart. Marcus's voice responded, The digitalis was your idea, Linda. I just provided the access through the pharmacy connections. If this comes back on us, it won't, Mom interrupted. I've been careful about everything. The photo alterations are working perfectly. Stephanie looks like she's always been part of our family, and Jessica looks like she was never part of it. By the time I'm finished, no one will even remember she existed. The recording ended, and I sat in stunned silence. Digitalis, Patricia said quietly, is a heart medication that can be deadly in the wrong doses. In small amounts over time, it can cause the exact type of heart failure your father experienced. I finally understood the full scope of what my mother had done. She hadn't just stolen my inheritance or tried to erase me from family photos. She had murdered my father, systematically poisoned him while planning her new life with Marcus. And tomorrow I was going to make her pay for all of it. The law office of Harrison and Associates occupied the entire 15th floor of downtown's tallest building. I'd chosen them specifically because they specialized in criminal law and had a reputation for taking on cases that other firms wouldn't touch. Attorney David Harrison had listened to my story and Patricia's evidence with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. What you're describing constitutes premeditated murder, he'd said during our initial consultation. But we need to be strategic about how we approach this. Your mother and Marcus have been building their new life for over a year now. They feel secure, untouchable. That's going to work in our favor. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Harrison would invite Mom and Marcus to his office under the pretense of a civil mediation regarding Dad's estate. He'd tell them I was considering dropping my remaining claims in exchange for a small settlement, and that all parties needed to meet to finalize the agreement. Given their eagerness to close this chapter permanently, Harrison was confident they'd agree to attend. What they wouldn't know was that Patricia had installed recording equipment in the conference room, and that Detective Rachel Santos from the city's homicide division would be listening from the adjacent office. The goal was to get Mom to incriminate herself on tape, providing the evidence needed for criminal charges. People who think they're smarter than everyone else can't resist explaining how clever they've been, Harrison had explained. We're going to give your mother the opportunity to brag about the perfect crime she thinks she committed. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 2 o'clock. I arrived 30 minutes early and took my position in the observation room. where I could watch through a one-way mirror while Detective Santos monitored the recording equipment. My hands were shaking as I watched Harrison arrange papers on the conference table, positioning everything to create the most natural conversational environment possible. Mom and Marcus arrived precisely on time. She looked radiant in a way I hadn't seen since before Dad's death, wearing an expensive blue dress that probably cost more than I made in a month. Marcus held her hand protectively as they walked into the conference room, his gray hair perfectly styled and his suit impeccably tailored. They looked like the kind of successful couple you'd see in magazine advertisements for luxury cars or vacation destinations. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Valdez, thank you both for coming, Harrison said, gesturing for them to sit across from him. I know, this has been a difficult process for everyone involved, but I believe we can reach a resolution today that will allow all parties to move forward. Mom settled into her chair with the confidence of someone who'd already won. We're hoping Jessica has finally come to her senses about this situation. It's time for her to accept reality and stop making these ridiculous claims about her relationship with Thomas. That's actually what I wanted to discuss, Harrison said, opening a thick file. Jessica has provided some additional documentation regarding her father's estate, and there are a few discrepancies we need to address before any settlement can be finalized. Marcus leaned forward slightly. What kind of discrepancies? Harrison pulled out a copy of Dad's medical records. According to these documents, Thomas Chen was experiencing cardiac symptoms for several weeks before his death. Yet he missed a scheduled appointment with a cardiologist that could have prevented the fatal heart attack. I watched Mom's expression carefully. There was no surprise, no confusion, just a slight tightening around her eyes that suggested annoyance at having to deal with this detail. Thomas was always stubborn about seeing doctors, she said smoothly. I encouraged him to keep that appointment, but he insisted he was feeling better. You can't force a grown man to take care of himself. Of course, Harrison agreed. Though, it's interesting that the cancellation call came from your phone number, not his. A brief flicker of something crossed Mom's face, but she recovered quickly. He asked me to call because he was at work. Is this really relevant to the settlement discussion? Harrison turned to another document. There's also the matter of your relationship with Mr. Valdez. You've stated that you met him at a grief support group after your husband's death, but we have evidence suggesting your relationship began considerably earlier. Now Marcus spoke up, his voice carrying a warning edge. I don't appreciate these implications, Mr. Harrison. Linda and I have been completely transparent about our relationship timeline. I'm sure you have, Harrison said pleasantly. But phone records can be very illuminating. For instance, we have documentation of over 300 calls and text messages between your numbers in the year preceding Thomas's death. The silence in the room stretched like a wire being pulled taut. I could see Mom's jaw clenching as she processed this information, trying to calculate how much Harrison actually knew versus how much he was guessing. People have friendships, she said finally. Marcus and I met at a community event and became friends long before anything romantic developed. There's nothing suspicious about that. Harrison nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense. Friendships are wonderful things, though this particular friendship seems to have involved some rather intimate moments. Hotel registrations, expensive. Dinners, weekend trips while Thomas was away on business contracts. Marcus's face was reddening. This is harassment. We came here in good faith to resolve a civil matter, not to be subjected to some kind of interrogation about our private lives. You're absolutely right, Harrison said, closing the file. I apologize if I've overstepped. Let's focus on the settlement. Jessica is willing to drop all remaining claims to her father's estate in exchange for $200,000. The number was deliberately high, designed to provoke a reaction. Mom's eyes flashed with anger. 200,000? That's ridiculous. She's not entitled to anything beyond what the court already awarded her. We went through probate, we followed the law, and the matter is settled. Actually, Harrison said, pulling out another document, There may be grounds to reopen the estate proceedings if we can demonstrate that relevant information was withheld during the original probate. What information? Marcus demanded. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression casual but his eyes sharp. Information about Thomas's medical treatment in the weeks before his death. Information about pre-existing relationships that might have influenced decision-making. Information about pharmaceutical access. The last phrase hit like a physical blow. Mom went completely still, her face draining of color. Marcus's hand tightened visibly on her arm. "I don't know what you're implying," Mom said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I'm not implying anything," Harrison replied. "I'm stating facts. Marcus, your family's pharmacy business has access to a wide range of medications, including cardiac drugs like digitalis. Linda, your internet search history shows extensive research into the therapeutic versus toxic doses of various heart medications, and we have witness testimony placing you at the pharmacy on multiple occasions in the weeks before Thomas's death." "This is insane," Marcus said, but his voice was shaking. "You can't seriously be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Harrison interrupted. "I'm telling you what we can prove. The question is whether you want to resolve this quietly through a civil settlement, or whether you'd prefer to let law enforcement handle the matter." Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We're leaving. This is nothing but wild speculation and blackmail." "Of course," Harrison said. "Though before you go, you might want to listen to this." He reached for a small recording device on the table and pressed play. Mom's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "We need to make sure she never finds out about the pills. If anyone discovers that I was giving them to him in the weeks before he died, everything falls apart." The blood drained from Mom's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Marcus made a choking sound and stumbled backward, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. That can't be," Mom whispered. "The digitalis was your idea." "Linda!" Marcus's recorded voice continued. "I just provided the access through the pharmacy connections." Mom's scream pierced the air like a siren. She lunged across the table toward the recording device, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at the air as Harrison calmly moved it out of her reach. "You destroyed everything!" she shrieked. "You couldn't just disappear like you were supposed. Too? You had to keep digging and digging until you ruined it all." The conference room door burst open, and Detective Santos stepped inside with 2 uniformed officers behind her. "Linda Chen and Marcus Valdez," she said, her voice steady and professional. "You're both under arrest for the murder of Thomas Chen." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Mom looked directly at the one-way mirror where she somehow knew I was watching. Her face was twisted with rage and something that might have been regret. "I gave you everything," she hissed. "I raised you and loved you, and this is how you repay me?" But I knew the truth now. She had never loved me. I had simply been useful to her until I wasn't anymore. And when that usefulness ended, she had tried to erase me from existence just as thoroughly as she had erased Dad from her life. The last thing I heard as they led her away was her voice, high and desperate. "Stephanie is going to be devastated. She doesn't understand. She thinks we're a real family." The trial began 6 months later on a cold February morning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters who had latched onto the story of the suburban mother who murdered her husband for money and tried to erase her daughter from existence. The local news had dubbed it the photo replacement murder, and the coverage had been relentless. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, watching as Mom was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit that made her look older and smaller than I remembered. She didn't look at me once during the entire proceedings, keeping her eyes fixed on her attorney or the judge, as if I had ceased to exist for her completely. Marcus had taken a plea deal early in the process, agreeing to testify against Mom in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years. His testimony was damning and detailed, describing how Mom had approached him with the plan to gradually poison Dad with digitalis while making it look like natural heart failure. She said it had to be slow and subtle, Marcus told the packed courtroom, his voice barely above a whisper. Small doses mixed into his coffee over several weeks. She researched everything: the symptoms, the timeline, how much would be needed to cause cardiac arrest without showing up obviously in an autopsy. The prosecution had built an airtight case. They presented the recorded confession, the medical evidence showing Dad's missed appointment, the financial records proving Mom's affair with Marcus, and most devastatingly, the pharmacy logs showing Marcus had been stealing digitalis tablets for months before Dad's death. But it was the photo evidence that seemed to affect the jury most deeply. The prosecutor had enlarged several of the altered family pictures and displayed them on easels in front of the courtroom. The careful precision of the replacements, the systematic erasure of my existence from decades of memories, painted a picture of calculating cruelty that went beyond simple murder for money. These photographs represent more than just the defendants' attempt to rewrite history, District Attorney Sarah Brennan told the jury during her closing argument. They demonstrate a level of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse that speaks to the defendant's character. Linda Chen didn't just want her husband dead for his money. She wanted to pretend that her daughter Jessica had never existed at all. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Robert Kramer, had tried to argue that Mom was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown after Dad's death, that the photo alterations were evidence of psychological distress rather than calculated malice. But the timeline didn't support his theory. Patricia's investigation had shown that Mom had started altering photos months before she actually moved them to the house mantel. The most shocking revelation came during the penalty phase, when Patricia took the stand to present additional evidence she'd uncovered during her extended investigation. While digging deeper into Mom's background, she'd discovered that I wasn't Mom's first victim. The defendant's first husband, Robert Jameson, died of an apparent heart attack 12 years before she married Thomas Chen, Patricia testified. At the time, Linda was listed as the sole beneficiary of his life insurance policy. The circumstances were remarkably similar: a sudden cardiac event in a previously healthy man, preceded by several weeks of unexplained symptoms. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Mom had been married before Dad? She'd never mentioned a previous husband, and there were no photos or mementos from any earlier marriage in our house growing up. Patricia continued, Robert Jameson had a daughter from a previous relationship, a girl named Melissa who was 8 years old when he died. After the funeral, Linda Jameson, as she was known then, systematically removed all traces of Melissa from the household. The child was eventually sent to live with distant relatives and lost all contact with her father's side of the family. I understood then that what had happened to me was part of a pattern. Mom was a serial killer who specialized in marrying men with children, murdering the fathers, and erasing the children from existence to claim everything for herself. I was just her latest victim, and if I hadn't fought back, I would have disappeared, as completely as Melissa had. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, first-degree murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and estate fraud, Mom finally looked at me. Her expression wasn't one of remorse or love or even recognition. It was pure, undiluted hatred, as if I had somehow wronged her by surviving her attempt to erase me. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led her away, she spoke for the first time during the entire trial. "Stephanie deserves better than this," she called out, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "She's going to need therapy for years because of what you've done to this family, Jessica." Even facing life in prison for murder, she was still trying to make me the villain of her story. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected changes to my life. The house on Oakwood Drive had been seized as proceeds of crime, but the insurance money from Dad's death was eventually released to me after the criminal conviction. More importantly, I received a call from a woman named Melissa Chen, formerly Melissa Jameson. "I saw the news coverage of your mother's trial," she said when I answered the phone. "I think Linda killed my father too. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and I was struck by how much we looked alike." Melissa was 10 years older than me, but we had the same dark hair and the same wary expression that came from surviving Linda Chen's particular brand of maternal cruelty. "She married my dad when I was 6, Melissa told me. For 2 years, everything seemed normal. She was kind to me, bought me clothes, helped with homework. But after Dad died, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, I was in the way, a burden, evidence of a life she wanted to forget. What happened to you after she sent you away?" "I was lucky. My aunt and uncle took me in, gave me a stable home. But I lost everything connected to my father. His photos, his belongings, even his last name eventually. Linda made sure there was nothing left of our life together. We spent hours comparing our experiences, finding comfort in the shared understanding of what it meant to be erased by someone who was supposed to love us." Melissa had built a good life despite her traumatic childhood. She was married with 2 young children and worked as a social worker helping at-risk families. "I never stopped wondering what happened to my father," she admitted. "The heart attack always seemed suspicious, but I was just a kid. No one would have listened to me even if I'd been able to articulate my concerns." Together, we petitioned the authorities to reopen Robert Jameson's case. With Patricia's help, we were able to gather enough evidence to get his body exhumed for additional testing. The results confirmed what we'd suspected. Traces of digitalis were still detectable in his remains after all these years. Mom was eventually charged with Robert's murder as well, though she would never face trial since. She was already serving life without parole. But for Melissa, having official recognition that her father had been murdered brought a sense of closure she'd been seeking for over 2 decades. 6 months after the trial, I drove back to Oakwood Drive one last time. The house had been sold to a young family with children, and I could see toys scattered across the front lawn and bicycles parked by the garage. It looked like a home where people were loved and wanted, where children grew up feeling secure in their place in the world. I thought about Dad and how proud he would be that I'd fought for the truth. I thought about Melissa and how we'd managed to find each other despite Mom's best efforts to erase us both. And I thought about Stephanie, who was now living with distant relatives after Marcus's conviction, trying to understand how the woman she'd thought was her loving stepmother had actually been a calculating killer. Some stories don't have happy endings, but they can have true ones. And sometimes, the truth is enough. 2 years after Mom's conviction, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. Through the peephole, I could see a teenage girl with long blonde hair and nervous eyes, clutching a manila envelope against her chest like armor. I recognized her immediately from the altered photographs that had started this whole nightmare. "Stephanie." "I know you probably don't want to see me," she said when I opened the door, "but I need to talk to someone who understands what Linda was really like." I invited her in, noting how she still couldn't bring herself to call Mom by anything other than her first name. She looked older than her 17 years, with the kind of premature maturity that comes from having your world shattered by adult betrayals. "I found these in my dad's storage unit," she said, opening the envelope to reveal a stack of photographs. "He kept them hidden from Linda. I think you should see them." The photos were originals, the real family pictures before Mom had butchered them with her scissors and glue. There I was at my graduation, grinning in Dad's old tie. There I was, blowing out candles on my 10th birthday, chocolate frosting smeared across my cheek. 23 years of genuine memories, preserved by Marcus in secret. "Why did he keep these?" I asked, my voice catching slightly. Stephanie sat down heavily on my couch, looking exhausted. "I think he felt guilty about what they were doing to you." Toward the end, before their arrest, he started acting strange. Drinking more, staying late at work, avoiding Linda's photo projects. She pulled out another envelope, this one containing documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements showing that Marcus had been secretly sending money to various charities in Dad's name, legal research about whistleblower protections, even a draft of a letter addressed to Detective Santos that was never sent. Dad was planning to confess, Stephanie said quietly. He couldn't live with what they'd done. But then you and your lawyer played that recording, and everything happened so fast. I studied her face, trying to read the emotions playing across her features. How are you dealing with all of this? Some days are better than others. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I spent 3 years thinking Linda was the perfect mother. She made me feel like I was the center of her universe, like nothing mattered more than making me happy. Finding out it was all built on murder and lies, it messes with your head. Are you getting help? Therapy? Yeah. Court-ordered counseling. My Aunt Sarah, my dad's sister. She's been great about making sure I have support. But there's something the therapists can't help with. She hesitated, then pulled out one final photograph. It was a picture I'd never seen before, taken at what looked like a family barbecue. Mom was standing between Dad and me, her arms around both of us, smiling genuinely at the camera. But someone had carefully drawn Marcus and Stephanie into the background, sketching them in pencil as if they belonged there. Linda made this about 6 months before your dad died, Stephanie explained. She showed it to me and said this was what our family was going to look like someday. She was already planning everything, the murder, the inheritance, merging. Our families, but she needed you gone to make it work. The casual way Stephanie discussed Mom's planning chilled me. This teenager had been living inside a fantasy orchestrated by a serial killer, and she was only now beginning to understand the full scope of the deception. There's something else, Stephanie continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Linda used to talk to me about you. She said you were mentally unstable, that you'd been trying to turn your father against her for years. She painted you as this jealous, vindictive person who couldn't accept that she'd found new happiness. You believed her. Of course I believed her. She was my stepmother. Why would she lie about something like that? Stephanie's eyes filled with tears. I actually felt sorry for her, having to deal with such a difficult daughter. I thought she was this long-suffering saint who deserved better. The manipulation was even more extensive than I'd realized. Mom hadn't just been working to erase me from the family photos and legal documents. She'd been systematically destroying my reputation with the people who would become her new family, ensuring that when I finally disappeared, no one would question it. She showed me the altered photos while she was making them, Stephanie admitted. She said she was fixing them, making them more accurate representations of what the family really looked like. She convinced me that you had never really belonged, that putting my face in those pictures was just correcting a historical mistake. I felt a wave of nausea imagining Mom sitting with this teenager, carefully crafting lies while teaching her to participate in erasing me from existence. The level of psychological manipulation was staggering. Did she ever talk about her first husband, Robert Jameson? Stephanie's eyes widened. She was married before my dad? I thought your father was her first husband. So Mom had hidden her previous marriage from Marcus and Stephanie, just as she'd hidden it from Dad and me. The pattern was becoming clearer. Each new family was meant to believe they were her fresh start, her only chance at real happiness. The previous husbands and children simply ceased to exist in her narrative. There's a woman named Melissa you should meet, I told Stephanie. She survived Linda once before. She might be able to help you understand what you're going through. Over the following months, Stephanie became a regular presence in my life. It was strange at first. She looked so much like the face that had haunted me from those altered photographs. But gradually, I began to see her as another one of Mom's victims, rather than her replacement. She was struggling with more than just the revelation of Mom's crimes. The girl who had grown up believing she was the cherished center of a loving blended family was now facing the reality that she'd been nothing more than a prop in a murderer's elaborate performance. Every memory of maternal love was now tainted with the knowledge that it had been calculated manipulation. "Sometimes I catch myself missing her," Stephanie confessed during one of our conversations. "Isn't that sick? I miss the woman who killed your father and tried to erase you from existence. But she was the closest thing to a real mother I'd ever had." "It's not sick," I assured her. "You're mourning the person you thought she was. That's normal. But how do I trust my own judgment about people now? If I couldn't see what Linda really was when I was living with her every day, how will I ever know if someone is being genuine with me?" It was a question I'd been grappling with myself. Mom's betrayal had left me questioning every relationship, every expression of affection, every moment of apparent sincerity. If the woman who raised me could murder my father and try to erase me from history, what was anyone else capable of? Through our shared therapy sessions with Dr. Angela Foster, a specialist in family trauma who worked with both Melissa and me, we began to develop strategies for rebuilding trust. The work was slow and often painful, but it was necessary. Healing from this kind of betrayal isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it doesn't matter, Dr. Foster explained during one of our group sessions. It's about learning to distinguish between the pathological behavior of one individual and the normal range of human relationships. Stephanie had started college by then, studying psychology with the goal of someday helping other victims of family violence. She said understanding the clinical aspects of what Mom had done helped her process the emotional trauma. "I keep thinking about all the red flags I missed," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the campus coffee shop where she worked part-time. "The way Linda was obsessed with controlling every detail of how our family looked to outsiders. How she never wanted me to get too close to my dad without her being present. The way she talked about you and Melissa, always as problems to be solved rather than people to be understood. You were a kid," I reminded her. "It wasn't your responsibility to see through an adult's manipulation. But I participated in it. I sat there while she cut your face out of those pictures and pasted mine in. I helped her practice her story about how we were always meant to be a family. I was an accessory to her psychological torture of you. You were a victim too, Stephanie. Don't let guilt about things you couldn't have understood consume you." But I knew the feeling she was describing. Even though I'd been the primary target of Mom's cruelty, I sometimes wondered what I could have done differently. Should I have seen the signs earlier? Should I have protected Dad somehow? Should I have fought harder for the truth before it was almost too late? The answer, Dr. Foster kept reminding us, was that we'd done the best we could with the information available to us at the time. Mom was a master manipulator who had spent years perfecting her techniques. The fact that we'd eventually seen through her deceptions and fought back was a testament to our strength, not evidence of our failure. As Stephanie prepared for her sophomore year, she made a decision that surprised everyone. "I want to change my last name," she announced during one of our coffee shop conversations. "I can't keep carrying my father's name when it reminds me every day of what he helped Linda do to your family." "What name would you choose?" She smiled. For the first time in months, a genuine expression of hope rather than performance. "I was thinking about Chen. If you'd be okay with that." It seems fitting somehow, taking the name of the family Linda tried to destroy as a way of honoring the memory of who your father really was. The request caught me completely off guard, but as I thought about it, I realized it made perfect sense. Stephanie Chen, daughter not by blood but by choice, survivor of Linda's manipulations, keeper of the photographic evidence that had helped bring justice for Dad. "I think Dad would like that," I told her. "I think he'd be proud to know his name lived on through someone who chose to carry it forward." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like we might actually be building something real from the ashes of Linda's destruction. 5 years after Mom's conviction, I stood in the visiting room of Millfield Correctional Facility, staring through reinforced glass at a woman I barely recognized. Prison had aged Linda Chen dramatically. Her once perfect hair was now streaked with gray and pulled back in a harsh ponytail, her expensive clothes replaced by a faded orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on her diminished frame. She picked up the phone on her side of the partition with hands that shook slightly, whether from medication or simple nervous tension. I couldn't tell. "I wondered when you'd finally come," she said, her voice raspier than I remembered. "Though I'm surprised. You bothered. I thought I was dead to you." "You are," I replied calmly. "I'm not here for reconciliation or closure. I'm here because there are things I need to tell you, and I want to see your face when I say them." Her eyes narrowed, and I caught a glimpse of the calculating woman who had orchestrated my father's murder. Prison might have diminished her physically, but the core of who she was remained unchanged. "Stephanie graduated from college last month," I began. "Summa cum laude, psychology degree. She's starting her master's program in trauma counseling in the fall. She sends her regards, by the way." "Actually, no. She doesn't. She asked me to tell you that she hopes you rot in here." Mom's composure cracked slightly. Stephanie was confused. "By all the lies you told about me. She'll understand the truth eventually. The truth is that she's thriving without you in her life. She's engaged to a wonderful man named David who treats her with genuine kindness, the kind you only pretended to show her. They're planning a small wedding next spring. Melissa and I are helping with the arrangements." "Melissa?" Mom's voice turned venomous. I should have known she'd crawl out of whatever hole she'd been hiding in once the news coverage started. "Melissa has been instrumental in helping law enforcement identify other potential victims of yours. Did you know they've reopened investigations into the deaths of 3 other men you were involved with over the years? Apparently, your pattern goes back much further than anyone initially realized." For the first time since I'd arrived, Mom looked genuinely shaken. "That's impossible. Those were completely different circumstances." "Were they?" "Harold Morrison in Phoenix died of a heart attack 6 months after you started dating him. He had a 16-year-old daughter who suddenly found herself unwelcome in his house after his death. Sound familiar?" Mom's hands were trembling more noticeably now. "Harold had a bad heart. Everyone knew that." "And Kenneth Walsh in Denver? Another sudden cardiac event. Another child who disappeared from the family narrative. The authorities are very interested in your employment history with various home health agencies in both cities." I watched as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Mom had always believed she was too clever to be caught, too careful to leave evidence behind. But her compulsion to repeat the same pattern had created a trail that investigators were now following back through decades of carefully constructed lies. "You always thought you were the smartest person in any room," I continued. "But you made one critical mistake. You underestimated how much people would care about the children you tried to erase." "I gave those children better lives, Mom," snapped, some of her old fire returning. "They were better off without fathers who couldn't provide for them properly. I was doing them a favor." The delusion was breathtaking in its completeness. Even now, facing life in prison for multiple murders, she genuinely believed she'd been acting in everyone's best interest. "Melissa's father left her a trust fund that you emptied," I said quietly. "Harold Morrison had been saving for his daughters. College education, money that disappeared after his death. Kenneth Walsh had life insurance specifically designated for his son's medical expenses. The boy had diabetes. That money vanished too. You weren't saving anyone, Linda. You were destroying families for profit." "You don't understand the financial pressures I was under," she protested. "The sacrifices I made trying to hold everything together. I understand perfectly. I've seen the financial records from all your marriages. You lived well beyond your means, accumulated massive debts, and then systematically murdered your way out of them. The only sacrifices you made were other people's lives." Mom fell silent, her eyes darting around the visiting room as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "There's something else you should know," I said, reaching into my bag. "Dad left something for me that I only found recently. Uncle Robert discovered it while cleaning out storage." I held up a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. "He wrote this about 2 months before you killed him. Apparently, he'd been suspicious of your behavior for a while." The color drained from Mom's face. "That's impossible. Thomas never suspected anything." "Dear Jessica," I read aloud, "if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and I want you to know that I love you more than anything in this world. I'm worried about your mother's behavior lately. She's been secretive about money, asking strange questions about my life insurance, and pushing me to avoid medical care even though I've been having chest pains. If something happens to me, please don't let her convince you that we weren't close. You are my greatest pride and joy, and nothing she says or does can change that." Mom's breathing had become shallow and rapid. He never said anything. He also left instructions for Uncle Robert to give this letter to the police if his death seemed suspicious. Fortunately for you at the time, everyone assumed his heart attack was natural, so Robert just held on to it. But it turns out Dad was smarter than you gave him credit for. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my bag. The prosecution has this now, of course. It's being used as evidence in the other cases they're building against you. "Why are you telling me this?" Mom asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I want you to understand that you failed completely. Every person you tried to erase is not only alive but thriving. Every family you tried to destroy has found ways to heal and move forward. And every lie you told is being exposed for what it really was." I stood up, preparing to leave. "Stephanie sends you a message, by the way. She said to tell you that she's kept one photo from your house, the family picture where you replaced my face with hers. She shows it to her therapy clients sometimes, as an example of how abusers manipulate reality to suit their needs. She says it's become quite useful in her practice." Mom's face contorted with rage. "You poisoned her against me. She loved me before you filled her head with lies. She loved the person she thought you were. But that person never existed, Linda. It was all just another performance, another manipulation. And now everyone knows it." As I walked toward the exit, Mom's voice followed me, high and desperate. "Jessica, wait! You can't just leave like this. I'm your mother. I raised you. That has to mean something." I turned back one final time. "You're not my mother. You're just a woman who happened to give birth to me. My real family is the one I've chosen. Melissa, Stephanie, Uncle Robert, the friends who stood by me during the trial. We're the ones who will remember Dad the way he really was, not the way you tried to rewrite him." The last thing I heard as the security door closed behind me was Mom screaming my name, her voice echoing off the concrete walls like a ghost trying to drag me back into her world of lies and manipulation. But I didn't look back. 6 months later, I received word that Linda Chen had been convicted on 3 additional counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death, though given the lengthy appeals process, she would likely spend the rest of her natural life in prison. I felt no satisfaction in the news, no sense of justice finally being served. What I felt was something much quieter and more profound, the knowledge that the truth had finally won over deception, that love had ultimately triumphed over manipulation. On the anniversary of Dad's death each year, Melissa, Stephanie, and I gather at his grave to share memories and lay flowers. We bring photos, the real ones that Marcus had saved, showing our families as they actually were, rather than as Linda had tried to remake them. Stephanie often brings her children now, twin boys who never knew their grandmother's dark history, but who grow up surrounded by the kind of unconditional love that Linda only pretended to offer. They call me Aunt Jessica, and when they're old enough, we'll tell them about their grandfather Thomas, the kind, generous man who loved his family fiercely, and whose memory deserves to live on untainted by the lies of the woman who killed. Him. Sometimes people ask me if I've forgiven my mother for what she did. The question always strikes me as missing the point entirely. Forgiveness implies a relationship worth preserving, a person worth redeeming. Linda Chen was never my mother in any meaningful sense of the word. She was simply a predator who wore the mask of maternal love until it no longer served her purposes. And some masks, once removed, reveal nothing worth forgiving underneath. What I've learned instead is something far more valuable: how to recognize genuine love when I see it, how to build real relationships based on truth rather than manipulation, and how to honor the memory of the people who truly mattered by living the kind of authentic life they would have wanted for me. In the end, that's the only victory that matters. Not revenge against Linda, but the simple act of choosing to live truthfully in a world where she chose deception at every turn. The photos on my mantle now show my real family, the people who chose to love me without condition, without agenda, without the need to erase anyone else from the picture. And unlike Linda's carefully crafted lies, these images will never need to be altered. They're already perfect just the way they are. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.